Henry Ford once said, "History is bunk." Progress was his dream. Progress on wheels. For most of us, history resembles a bunk bed, with the present lying on top, while the past sleeps peacefully underneath. Only occasionally does a date or an anniversary awaken within us a sense of great events, like, say, the Boston Tea Party, or the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Burry Port is a quiet seaside town in Carmarthenshire, West Wales. A town which had greatness thrust upon it 95 years ago when a seaplane swooped down from the sky to land on the Burry estuary. June the 18th, 1928 is a date that the people of Burry Port will never forget. For it is a date that, by sheer serendipity, the attention of the world became focused on their town. Charles Lindbergh wins the Orteig Prize of $25,000 for making the first non-stop flight from New York to Paris. Lindbergh's flight of 33 hours would also be the first solo transatlantic flight in history. His daring flight would make Lindbergh a worldwide celebrity and earn him the nickname Lucky Lindy. And never was a nickname more appropriate. Stanton Worcester and Noel Davis were testing their plane Pathfinder for a transatlantic attempt in 1927. While over Virginia, the Pathfinder nosedived, killing both pilots. French First World War ace René Fonck was another to attempt a crossing in 1926. Fonck survives the crash, but 2 of his crewmates would perish. Charles Nongesset and François Colly attempted to cross the Atlantic east to west from Paris to New York. Their plane was last seen off the coast of Ireland, and despite a massive search effort, no wreckage was ever found. Since Alcock and Brown crash-landed into a bog in Ireland in 1919, to become the first to cross the Atlantic by plane, a transatlantic flight was still seen as the ultimate and the most dangerous feat in aviation. The successful transatlantic flight of Charles Lindbergh solidified the belief among many that aviation was a pursuit exclusively for men. But there were some who disagreed. Amy Phipps Guest, a Florida socialite now living in London, was one of them. Despite having no flying experience, the 56-year-old was determined to prove that a woman could make the same journey across the Atlantic with equal skill as a man. With her wealth and connections to high society, Guest assembled a team of professionals to support her endeavour. She sought the guidance of famed explorer, Commander Richard Byrd, who would act as a technical advisor. Byrd would also sell Amy Guest his Fokker F7 trimotor, which he had planned to use for a South Pole mission. Amy Guest named the plane Friendship to commemorate the special relationship between the United States and her new home, Great Britain. Additionally, she sought the assistance of George Palmer Putnam, a publicist and publisher of Charles Lindbergh's autobiography, We. Putnam, who virtually created the concept of a celebrity biography, was instrumental in making Lindbergh a household name. To help ensure the success of the flight, Guest hired one of the finest aviators of the time, Wilmer Bill Stultz, to do the majority of the flying. Stultz had recently made history as the first pilot to fly non-stop from New York to Havana. She also hired mechanic and co-pilot Louis Slim Gordon, whose knowledge of tri-motor planes was second to none. Guest intended to join them on the flight and become the first woman to cross the Atlantic. However, her family were horrified when they learned of her plans, as they were aware of the numerous failed attempts by other women to make the same journey. Princess Anne of Lowenstein-Wertheim-Freudenberg, with Captain Leslie Hamilton, took off from Wiltshire in her plane St. Raphael, also a Fokker F-7, bound for Ottawa. The plane was last seen many miles off course by a Dutch steamer 400 miles southeast of New York. The aircraft was never seen again. In December 1927, Francis Wilson Grayson, Captain Oscar Omdahl and two others took off from Long Island in their plane, the Dawn, heading for Newfoundland. Last seen off Cape Cod, the Dawn never reached Newfoundland. Fragmented radio messages suggested they had come down at sea, perhaps off Nova Scotia. But an extensive search found no trace of the aircraft. In March 1928, Elsie Mackay and pilot Captain Walter Hinchcliffe took off from Lincolnshire in her plane Endeavour. 5 hours later, it was last seen by a lighthouse keeper who observed the monoplane over the village of Crookhaven near Cork. 8 months later, a single piece of the plane's undercarriage washed ashore in northeast Ireland. Lily DeLenz and Ruth Elder made attempts in 1927. Lily DeLenz's plane ditched off the coast of Portugal, whereas Ruth Elder ditched near the Azores. Fortunately, both were rescued. Initially, Amy Guest ignored her family's pleas not to fly, but when faced with an ultimatum from her son Raymond to either quit the flight or risk him quitting Cambridge in protest, Guest relented and decided to sponsor the project instead. She tasked George Putnam with finding the right sort of girl, a pilot who was well educated, well mannered, physically attractive, and passionate about aviation. Putnam's friend, Captain Hilton Rayleigh, was assigned to find the suitable candidate. He contacted Rear Admiral Reginald R. Belknap from Boston, who recommended Amelia Earhart, a gifted pilot who worked as a social worker in Boston. Upon meeting Earhart, Putnam immediately recognized her potential and agreed with Rayleigh's assessment that she was indeed the right sort of girl.
I was born on the 24th of July, 1897 in Atchison, Kansas to my parents, Amy and Edwin Earhart. My sister Muriel and I were partially raised by our grandparents, spending the school year in Atchison and the summers with my parents in Kansas City. Both Muriel and I were tomboys. We would spend our early years outdoors hunting and sledding. Due to my father's legal work with the railroads, we moved to Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois later on in my childhood. In the midst of the First World War, I left my studies at the prestigious Ogontz Girls' School in Philadelphia and moved to Toronto to work as a voluntary aid detachment nurse at a military convalescent hospital. In 1921, I had my first flying lesson with the legendary Nita Snook. Just a year later, I set the women's altitude record at Rogers Airfield in Los Angeles, soaring up to 14,000 feet. In 1923, I became only the 16th woman to receive an international pilot's license. As my parents went through a divorce, I moved in with my mother and sister near Boston and got a job at Denison House as a social worker and a teacher with the local immigrant community. But one day I received a phone call from Captain Hilton Rayleigh. From then on, my life would never be the same.
When Commander Byrd sold Amy Guest his Fokker F-7B trimotor, he did so in secret. Indeed, secrecy was the order of the day whilst Friendship was being prepared at East Boston Airport, in order to avoid attention from the press or any potential competitors. As far as the patrons of the airport and the press were concerned, Friendship was still the property of Commander Byrd and was being prepared for his Antarctic expedition. The true purpose of the flight would not be revealed until Friendship was already in the air and on its way to Newfoundland.
When I first saw Friendship, she was jacked up in the shadows of a hangar at East Boston Airport. Mechanics and welders worked nearby on the struts for the pontoons that were shortly to replace the wheels. The ship's golden wings with their spread of 72 feet was strong and exquisitely fashioned. The red-orange of the fuselage, though blending with the gold, was not chosen for artistry but for practical use. If we had come down, orange could have been seen further than any other color. Many people don't realize when they see a monoplane in the air is the thickness of the wings. From bottom to top, the wing of Friendship measured about 28 inches in some places, but after all this, in comparison with the great wing spread of 72 feet, gives an appearance of slightness. For a long cruise, extra gasoline carrying capacity is needed, so Friendship was equipped with 2 special tanks, elliptical affairs, which bulged into the space just aft of the cockpit usually occupied by the passengers.
When the Friendship was ready, it would be towed out to the Jeffrey Yacht Club in East Boston, where it would be moored in readiness for its flight.
The cameramen and the small group who came to see the departure were in a happy mood. It was the 3rd time they had assembled. Twice before, the weather had prevented a getaway. Slim Gordon uncovered the motors. Bill Stoltz tinkered a bit with his radio and in the cockpit. Slim dropped down from the fuselage to the starboard pontoon, hopped over to the other, and cranked the port motor. Soon all 3 were turning over. And then suddenly, the adventure began. The dream became actuality. We were off.
Wilma Stultz turns northeast to begin the first leg of Friendship's journey from Boston to Trepassey in Newfoundland, Canada. Shortly after the plane had left Boston, George Putnam revealed the Friendship's true purpose and introduced Amelia Earhart to the world. He also provided the press with a striking and iconic series of photographs of Earhart taken before the flight. The similarity to well-known photographs of Charles Lindbergh were obvious and deliberate. And much to publicist George Putnam's delight, the press were all too eager to label Amelia Earhart Lady Lindy to mirror Charles Lindbergh's nickname of Lucky Lindy. Roughly halfway through their journey from Boston to Trepassey, Friendship encountered thick fog and Wilma Stultz was forced to land the plane at Halifax, Nova Scotia. It was decided it would be best to stay the night and wait for an improvement in the weather. The crew checked in at an hotel in nearby Dartmouth, expecting a quiet night. But with Putnam's press release, news of their flight had preceded them and their arrival at Halifax had been noticed. Local reporters and cameramen quickly arrived at their hotel, eager for a scoop. Much to Earhart's annoyance, Stultz and Gordon reluctantly agreed to an interview in their room.
12 p.m. 2 reporters and cameramen are in the next room trying to persuade Stultz and Gordon to dress and have a flashlight picture taken. I am displeased with their thoughtlessness in keeping Slim and Bill from their beds. I am dropping things and making noises in my room to make them realize I am still awake and disapproving. I don't know whether the newspaper men know I am here, so I am not shouting my sentiments.
The next morning, the crew agreed to a photo outside the hotel. It would be the first photo of Amelia Earhart as a celebrity. With the weather significantly improved, the crew boarded the Friendship and resumed their flight to Trepassey. Friendship arrived at Trepassey on the 4th of June. It was expected that the crew stay would be short, and after refueling, they would be on their way across the Atlantic. Their arrival, unexpected by most of the population of the village, was greeted with much excitement.
We had expected a pretty routine landing, and so I crawled into the cockpit to take pictures of the reception committee. But as a matter of fact, Friendship's arrival resembled a rodeo. At once, a dozen small boats began to circle madly about us, the local motto seeming to be that the early boat catches the plane. It happened that we had arranged for a mooring of our own to which we wished to be directed, but each local optimist felt that if he contrived to get us in tow first, he could take the prize to his own mooring and reap appropriate reward. Poised in the bows of the launches, each maritime cowboy whirled aloft a coil of rope, attempting to cast it at us. Slim, out on the pontoon, was doing his best to keep clear and yelled frantically to ward them off. The noise of the idling motors, augmented by the racket of the small boats, made hearing difficult. I was convulsed with laughter. At the height of the excitement, enthusiasm completely overcame one would-be welcomer. He hurled his rope and landed a bullseye on Slim, nearly knocking him into the water. The tempo of the maritime merry-go-round was extraordinary. Truly, I've never had a more entertaining half-hour.
Not long after Friendship's arrival, the weather made a change for the worse.
June the 5th, 2:45 p.m. There is a howling gale outside. The wind has blown steadily since we arrived and is getting worse now. Bill says it would be grand if we were in the air, but we can't take off against the hill across the bay, as we'd have to turn, and turning would mean a slide into the water with a heavily loaded plane and a side wind. Slim is aboard now, repairing a crack in the oil tank with cement and adhesive tape. It was thought first that the case would have to be taken off. An impossible job in the wind. The radio was cutting out yesterday, but today, Bill says he found the trouble in a loose connection.
It was like nothing they ever...
We are lodged in one of the mansions of the town. Mrs. Devereaux, at the home of whom we were lodged, was quite overcome and felt me to be sure I was present in the flesh. We may not get off tomorrow as the wind is as violent as ever, which means the expected storm is coming nearer.
The expected storm would last for 3 days and would be succeeded by more unfavourable weather, making any attempt at a takeoff impossible. In the days of waiting, Stultz and Gordon would fish and Earhart would walk around Trepassey taking photos. They would gather at night to play gin rummy. It wasn't until June the 12th that good local conditions and a favourable weather report from the Met Office meant a takeoff attempt could take place.
June the 12th. This has been the worst day. The receding tide made the sea so heavy that the spray was thrown so high that it drowned the outboard motors. As we gathered speed, the motors would cut and we'd lose the precious pull necessary. We unloaded every ounce of stuff from the plane, camera, my coat, bags, cushions, etc. She would have gone but for the motors. There was salt water above the prop hubs. We are all too disappointed to talk about it. The boys are in bed and I am going soon.
More forecasts of bad weather would follow, as would news that a potential competitor, Miss Mabel Ball, was on her way to Newfoundland to make her own attempt at an Atlantic crossing. Unlike Friendship, Mabel Ball's plane, Columbia, had a conventional undercarriage and could take off in any fine weather without thought for sea conditions. And also unlike Friendship, Columbia had already crossed the Atlantic a year earlier. The continued takeoff failures, poor weather, and the threat from Mabel Ball would dramatically affect crew morale, and despite the unerring kindness and hospitality of the people of Trepassey, frustrations among the crew would increase, with Bill Stultz turning to drink. June the 17th. After a 12-day wait, the weather conditions and tide were, although not ideal, better than at any other time at Trepassey. The Atlantic weather report from the Met Office indicated a possible improvement as well. Earhart and Gordon decided that this day presented their best chance to attempt a takeoff. Unfortunately, Wilma Stultz was hungover from drinking heavily the night before. Earhart and Gordon spent several hours pouring black coffee into their pilot before dragging him to the plane. Meanwhile, at Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, Mabel Ball's team received the same weather report. However, they decided to wait for further improvements in Atlantic weather the next day. This decision, although understandable, would be fateful. At 11:15 a.m., after 2 aborted attempts to take off, to lighten the plane, the crew pump out as much fuel as possible, leaving only 700 gallons, barely enough, they calculated, to reach island. After a grueling 3-mile takeoff run, Friendship eventually reaches its takeoff speed of 50 miles an hour. Being a Sunday, much of the population of Trepassey were in church, and the sound of propellers on the water had become routine. meaning eyewitnesses to Friendship's final takeoff attempt were few.
The villagers had seen us start so often. They had lost faith, so there were only a few on shore to see the Friendship take the air. Our rations for the flight might be considered eccentric. About half of the 5 gallons of mineral water put on at Boston remained. There were 3 egg sandwiches. 8 of 9 oranges survived from the original supply. A couple of tins of Drake's oatmeal cookies were luxury. I had left a telegram to be sent to George Putnam half an hour after we had gone. It read, "Violet. Cheerio." The code word Violet meant we are just hopping off. That was our official goodbye to America. Bill is nosing her down, all motors wide. We are bucking a headwind and rain. It's the heaviest storm I have ever been in the air and had to go through. The sea below looks fairly placid, but of course the surface appears flat from 3,000 feet. We have been out of snow a long while now, and the sun is shining, and the water is blue as far as one can see. There are some clouds ahead. They look high and wide.
The clouds that Earhart saw would continue from there on. It would be near voyage end that the ocean would become visible again. Along with the near zero visibility afforded by the fog and clouds, at around 7 hours into the flight, the radio died, which meant that the Friendship could no longer contact passing ships for an accurate position. As the hours passed, it became increasingly evident that an important objective of the flight would remain unfulfilled. Amelia Earhart had made it clear from the start that the role of mere passenger held no appeal to her, and that she wished to take her turn at the controls. In fact, Earhart's official position aboard Friendship was commander, with Stultz and Gordon being her subordinates while Friendship was in the air. All involved with this endeavour recognised that it was important that Amelia fly the plane for a portion of the flight, weather permitting, as the entire purpose of the flight was to promote the concept of a woman flying the ocean. However, the thick cloud significantly reduced visibility, making it necessary to fly Friendship solely by cockpit instruments, a skill Earhart had not yet learned. The time had at last arrived that, had Friendship been on course, the crew knew they should be seeing the coast of Ireland. But there was no sign of land. Friendship and its crew, it would seem, were off course and lost. Amelia Earhart would later admit that this was the only time on the voyage that she felt genuine fear, a fear that can be heard in her last logbook entries.
Logbook. 8:50 a.m. 2 boats. Trans steamer. Trying to get bearing. Radio won't work. 1 hour's gas. What a mess. All craft cutting our course? Why? So the log ends. Its last page recorded that we had but 1 hour's supply of gas left, that the time of reaching Ireland had passed, that the course of the vessel sighted perplexed us, that our radio was useless. Where were we? Should we keep faith with our course and continue? The mess epitomized the blackness of the moment. Were we beaten? The transatlantic steamer we saw was the USS America, although we had no idea of her identity at the time. With the radio crippled in an effort to get our position, Bill scribbled a note. I used one of our remaining oranges to weigh it down. I tied in a bag with an absurd piece of silver cord. As we circled the America, the bag was dropped through the hatch. But the combination of our speed, the movement of the vessel, the wind, and the lightness of the missile was too much for our marksmanship. We tried another shot using our last remaining orange. No luck. Bill leaped to the radio with the hope of at least receiving a message, but to no avail. At some moment in the excitement, before I closed the hatch which opens in the bottom of the fuselage, I lay flat and took a photograph. This, I am told, is the first one made of a vessel at sea from a plane in transatlantic flight.
The plane circled twice around the vessel and made 2 attempts to drop a message aboard, but each time the message fell in the water about 200 feet from the America and sank. I commanded the wireless operator to communicate with Friendship, but he received no reply. I also ordered the ship's name and position to be chalked on the deck, but before this could be done, the plane had risen and made off rapidly in a northerly direction. Shortly afterward, I observed it swing round to the east and disappear.
Had Friendship stayed with the America for a few more minutes, they would have learned that they were 75 miles east of the town of Queenstown, which is now called Cove. Bill Stultz would undoubtedly have turned northwards, and Friendship would have made landfall on the southeast coast of Ireland.
We could see only a few miles of water, which melted into the grayness on all sides. The ceiling was so low, we could fly at an altitude of only 500 feet. As we moved, our miniature world of visibility, bounded by its walls of mist, moved with us. Half an hour later, into it suddenly swam a fishing vessel. In a matter of minutes, a fleet of small craft, probably fishing vessels, were almost below us. Happily, their course paralleled ours. Although the gasoline in the tanks was vanishing fast, we began to feel land. It might not be Ireland, but any land would do just then. Bill, of course, was at the controls. Slim, gnawing a sandwich, sat beside him when out of the mists there grew a blue shadow, in appearance no more solid than hundreds of other nebulous landscapes we had sighted before. For a while Slim studied it, then turned and called Bill's attention to it. It was land. Soon several islands came into view and then a coastline. From it we could not determine our position. The visibility was so poor. For some time we cruised along the edge of what we thought was typical English countryside.
Well, I can remember it vividly in my mind now as if it was yesterday. I was living in Glamwood House, Burry Port, digging a garden in the back. And I suddenly heard something going on. What the hell is that coming over there? A mountain, now, see, come over the mountain. Pembury Mountain. Up through the mountain now, up towards Nestle, round Clumping Cloud, and back again. You come over the plains, over the park in Burry Port. Orange red plane, seaplane, and on the side in white letters was Friendship. And what the devil is a seaplane over the mountain?
It was about between 12 and 1 o'clock midday on Monday, the 18th of June, 1928. And we heard this aeroplane. We all dashed out to the garden, and to our surprise, there was the Friendship passing over. She was quite low. You could easily read the name on her fuselage.
So we went in the house, and I told the men in the house, my mother kept the Glamour Arms in Burry Port, public house. The ship, the plane what they called the Friendship, just landed in Poole. So he said, oh, that's somebody coming from Australia, somebody supposed to land in Ireland. Well, it's landed in Poole, so what do you mean? I said.
Bill decided to land. After circling a factory town, he picked out the likeliest stretch and bought the Friendship down on it. Our fuel was so low that it had ceased to flow to the carburetors during our landing run. There at Burry Port, Wales, On the morning of June the 18th, we opened the door of the fuselage and looked out upon what we could see of the British Isles through the rain. For Bill and Slim and me, it was an introduction to the old world. Curiously, the first crossing of the Atlantic for all of us was in the Friendship. None that may follow can have the quality of this initial voyage. Although we all hope to be able to cross by plane again, we have visions of doing so in a transatlantic plane liner. Slim dropped down upon the starboard pontoon and made fast to a large buoy with a rope we had on board for just such a purpose. We didn't doubt that tying to the buoy in such a way was against official etiquette and that shortly we should be reprimanded by some marine traffic cop. But the buoy was the only mooring available, and as we'd come rather a long way, we risked offending. We could see factories in the distance and hear the hum of activity. Houses dotted the green hillside. We were some distance offshore, but the beach looked muddy and barren. The only people in sight were 3 men working on a railroad track at the base of the hill. To them we waved and Slim yelled lustily for service. Finally they noticed us, straightened up, and even went so far as to walk down to the shore and look us over. Then their animation died out and they went back to their work. The Friendship simply wasn't interesting. An itinerant transatlantic plane meant nothing. In the meantime, 3 of 4 more people had gathered to look us over. I waved a towel desperately out the front window, and one friendly soul pulled off his coat and waved back. It must have been nearly an hour before the first boats came out.
According to Earhart, the first boat to come to the Friendship was piloted by Norman Fisher, a manager at the Frickers Metalworks in Burry Port. But according to many locals, it was a gentleman named Di Harvey Thomas who first made contact with the crew while out fishing in his rowing boat.
So I went down the dock for a walk now. I went down the dock for a walk. An old fellow called Di Harvey, a fisherman in Burry Port. I got on the dock, and the first man I seen going out in the rowing boat was Di, on the deck. I looked around, and people started coming from everywhere. Crowds from everywhere, even the school children were down there. And Di Harvey went to the boat, and he mentioned the wing Welsh. Did I ferry on then? Of course, they didn't understand what he meant, and he told them, oh, you're in a place called Burry Port, he said.
I went down, I could see the aeroplane, and somebody said it was my father, Di Harvey, there. And of course then all the boats, they were all coming in then. He was on his own when she landed, and he was the one who went to her. I've been told my father was with us. I said, no, my father was on his own. It's his credit.
What was he doing that morning?
Fishing. That was his right, he was fishing, whatever chance he had, he knew that every inch of that river.
Bill went ashore with Norman Fisher and telephoned our friends at Southampton while Slim and I remained on the Friendship.
Cyril Jeffries, a clerk with the Great Western Railways, was at the harbour to greet Wilma Stultz ashore. Stultz's appearance made a huge impression on Jeffries. He was dressed in a grey trilby at a nonchalant angle, a light Macintosh coat and a double-breasted suit, just as if he was going for a stroll down Broadway. His appearance enhanced my respect for him. The normality of his appearance suggested the coolness of a man of courage.
A vigorous ferry service was soon instituted, and many small boats began to swarm about us.
The crew were welcomed by local dignitaries who rowed out to the Friendship. The High Sheriff of Carmarthenshire extended an invitation for the crew to stay at his residence for the evening. Despite the kind offer, the crew had intended to remain moored to the buoy and refuel on the estuary before flying onwards to Southampton. Therefore, they respectfully declined the sheriff's invitation. News of the successful flight spread rapidly. Reporters from across the UK made their way to Burry Port by train and seaplane. On receiving the news from Wilma Stultz that Friendship's flight was a success and was at a town called Burry Port in South Wales, Captain Hilton Rayleigh, one of the flight organisers in Southampton, immediately chartered a seaplane to Burry Port.
Late in the afternoon, Captain Hilton Rayleigh, the gentleman who originally invited me on this adventure, arrived by seaplane from Southampton with Alan Raymond of the New York Times. Owing to the racing tide, it was decided not to try to take off but to leave the plane at Burry Port and stay at a nearby hotel for the night.
Thousands had seen the mysterious plane flying over the estuary hours earlier, and now, mainly by word of mouth, news of its significance had spread. Almost the entire population of Burry Port and thousands from the surrounding area flocked to Burry Port Harbour to see history in the making.
I was employed at the Burry Port Cooperative Bakery, and I had to go up to see it in the co-op. Then there was a flat roof on top, so the only way we could see it was do a bit of dodging from work and run up, but only the agile could go up there, you know, because it was a bit of a struggle. And from there, I saw straight down to the bay, the seaplane. The crowds came from everywhere in such a short time. Where they came from and where did they have the news, I don't know, because we didn't have the communications then so easy as we got it today. And I think they thought they were in Ireland. It was such a small little thing to think that it crossed the Atlantic and arrive in Burry Port of all places. As Max Boyce says, I was there.
My cousin, Mrs. Brinley Morris, went alongside the Friendship on her arrival in the harbour to greet Miss Earhart.
Of course, all the excitement was on then when I came home to tea. So, of course, the first thing we'd done was to go down to the harbour. Met my boyfriend, and he got his punt out, and we went down the steps to get down to the bottom of the water. And we rode right round, as close, quite close to the seaplane. Well, we couldn't get any closer. And we had a good view. I think we had one of the best views, I think.
Back in Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, news of the successful flight of the Friendship had reached Mabel Ball and her team. They immediately abandoned their attempted crossing and flew back to New York. There was little point in risking any lives just to come second. Mabel Ball's pilot, Captain Leboutier, was greatly disappointed that he had not risked taking off the day before. His plane, Columbia, with its greater speed and range, would, in all likeliness, have arrived in Europe before the Friendship, relegating Friendship's arrival at Burry Port to a sideshow.
It was with one foot aboard the Friendship and the other on the float alongside that I caught my first glimpse of this intrepid American. Tall and slim, with a boyish figure clad in the regulation Sidcot aviation suit, at first I mistook her for a man, until with a brilliant smile that lit up an extraordinarily attractive face, she bent down and cordially shook me by the hand.
Yes, she is not very big. She was very slight, not tall. And she had a mop of curly hair. And it was like a gingery colour. And she stood on the wing of the plane.
Never seen so many people in such a short time. The following morning we had 3 planes on the cricket pitch there, which never seen.
Word spread right around the world very quickly indeed.
Yes, the reporters from the different papers, the Sunday Express and what have you.
As the boat carrying Earhart approached the crowds massed at the harbour slipway, one trophy hunter in the throng took a keen interest in the bandana headscarf that was clearly visible, hanging out of Earhart's back pocket.
When they landed, steps coming up, all that was line from the water's edge right away up to the top. But now as Miss Vera was walking up, a fellow by the name of Gladney Evans, his mother used to give the national child in Burry Port, was halfway down the slip.
And he was standing there, about 3 deep, there was about 6 or 7 deep each side of the steps coming up, and he packed. And as he came up, that step was loose on the edge.
He grabbed the end of a headscarf and put it away. She looked down. Couldn't find who I did, but off they went.
I say, Gladney, I said, hey, Gladney, what do you do? Ah, look, he said, I got this. Headscarf.
There were 6 policemen to handle the crowd. That they got us through was remarkable. In the enthusiasm of their greeting, those hospitable Welsh people nearly tore our clothes off. Finally, we reached the shelter of the Frickers Metal Company office, where we remained until police reinforcements arrived. In the meantime, we had tea, and I knew I was in Britain.
They went to the Copworks offices, the old Copworks office, which was near the harbour, and had cups of tea with Mr. and Mrs. Tom Williams. And Mr. and Mrs. Williams used to boast to their dying days that she still had the cups and saucers that they drank tea from.
Twice before the crowd would let us get away, we had to go to an upper balcony and wave. They just wanted to see us. I tried to make them realize that all the credit belonged to the boys, who did all the work. But from the beginning, it was evident the accident of sex, the fact that I happened to be the first woman to have made the Atlantic flight, made me the chief performer in our particular sideshow.
Earhart was never comfortable with being the centre of attention ahead of Stultz and Gordon, and when asked about the flight by a reporter, she gave a now famous reply.
Bill did all the flying. He had to. I was just baggage, like a sack of potatoes. Maybe someday, I'll try it alone.
4 years later, she would do exactly that. The crew were taken by car to the Ashburnham Hotel in nearby Pembrey, where they would stay the night. At the hotel, after a meal, Stultz and Gordon were, at last, able to go to bed and get some well-earned sleep. Earhart, who was still in a state of shock from her first experience with fame and adulation, would have to wait a few more hours before she could get to her bed. Her story had been sold exclusively to the New York Times, and their correspondent, Alan Raymond, had a deadline to beat. They spoke in private for a few hours, and Earhart gave Raymond her logbook. He went back to the Flicker's offices to write up his story. As he finished each sheet, the local policeman was waiting to take it by car to be wired by the General Post Office in Llanelli. The news had by now crossed the planet and was the biggest story in the world. There was only one headline on the front pages of the major newspapers of the time.
We managed to have dinner and what was most comforting of all, hot baths. The latter were highlights of our reception, being the first experience of the kind since leaving Boston weeks, or was it months previously. Sleep that night was welcome. In all, we had 5 or 6 hours.
It is said that she was woken the next morning by the song of birds, whose thrilling notes floated in through the window. Sleep, it seemed, had completely washed away the stress of the previous day. When Miss Alice Jones, the proprietor of the Ashburnham Hotel, brought Earhart a hearty breakfast of bacon and eggs to her bed, Earhart was quoted to have said,
"How lovely your country is. The stillness and the silence brings back again the almost awesome feeling which came to me as, hour after hour, we pushed forward through the thick clouds and fog. It was as if we were alone in the world. To think that 48 hours ago I was in America and now I am in Wales. Well, it's jolly good to feel that I have an appetite that can do justice to such a meal."
Overnight, Friendship was given enough fuel to reach its final destination, Southampton. After a short drive from the Ashburnham Hotel, the crew again made their way through the crowds to a small boat that would take them back to Friendship. A young girl threw a flower to Amelia Earhart, who was heard to say,
"How sweet."
The crew of Friendship were not the only aviators in Burry Port on the morning of the 19th of June. Sir Arthur Whitten Brown, who, with his companion John Alcock, had made the first non-stop transatlantic flight 9 years previously, was also in town. Whitten Brown, who was then living in Swansea just 15 miles away, had made the short journey to Burry Port with his family in order to shake hands with Miss Earhart and give her a bouquet of flowers. A local policeman ordered a boatman to rush the Whitten Browns out in a rowing boat to the plane. A historic meeting between the first man and the first woman to cross the Atlantic by air seemed certain. But Wilma Stultz, who like the rest of the crew was oblivious to the events unfolding outside the plane, moved Friendship out of the harbour and away from the Whitten Browns, much to the disappointment of onlookers.
When I arrived, the crowds were so dense, I could not get near the machine. I searched Burry Port for some considerable time but failed to find them. I know the wonder of their achievement and would have liked to have offered my personal congratulations, but it wasn't to be.
Following morning, I went down the following morning at about 10 o'clock. Crowds of people at the docks in Burry Port. The Boys' Council School, the infant school, and the girls' school.
Although Friendship is most famous for carrying the first woman across the Atlantic, on its flight from Trepassey to Burry Port, it achieved another remarkable aviation milestone. It became the first seaplane to complete a transatlantic flight. Due to the remoteness of Trepassey, it was only when she reached Burry Port did Earhart discover that she had been given the nickname Lady Lindy by the press. a name that the fiercely independent Earhart was not fond of.
With the descent of reporters, one of the first questions I was asked was whether I knew Charles Lindbergh and whether I thought I looked like him. Gleefully, they informed me that I had been dubbed Lady Lindy. I explained that I had never had the honor of meeting Colonel Lindbergh, that I looked like no one in the world, and that I would grasp the first opportunity to apologize to him for innocently inflicting the idiotic comparison.
Friendship climbed slowly into the sky, and after circling the harbour 3 times, it turned south on a heading for Southampton. It was during this short flight that Amelia Earhart would, at long last, take the controls of Friendship. In Southampton, Friendship was greeted with similar scenes seen the day before in Burry Port. To ensure the safety of the crew, and to ensure they didn't lose any more clothing, extra police were called in to escort the crew through the crowds. Waiting at Southampton was Amy Guest, the lady who first imagined the flight of Friendship and was its sponsor. It would be Earhart's and Guest's first meeting. The crew then embarked on a short tour of England, where they would mix with the great and the good of English high society. They would also pay their respects at the Cenotaph and the Edith Cavell Memorial in London. But the highlight for the social worker Amelia Earhart would be a visit to Toynbee Hall, which, much like Denison House back home in Boston, did much to help those facing poverty in the East End of London. With their English tour at an end, it was time for the crew to return to the States, where the real celebrations would begin. The crew of Friendship had not yet set foot on land before they were mobbed by the press as their transatlantic liner, the SS President Roosevelt, moored at New York. The crew would receive a hero's welcome and ticker-tape parades at New York, Boston and Chicago. President Calvin Coolidge would invite them to the White House as guests of honor. 32 other American cities had invited the crew for civic receptions, but that was deemed too heavy a schedule even for the hardy crew of Friendship. After their final reception in Chicago, the crew of Friendship parted ways, never to meet again. After the excitement of the 18th and 19th of June 1928, Burry Port returned to its pre-Friendship obscurity. But there were those who wished to commemorate these momentous events. Only days after the landing, talk of a Friendship memorial at Burry Port had already reached Boston. The Burry Port Town Council Development Committee, who were responsible for the memorial project, contacted Mrs. Amy Guest, the sponsor of the Friendship flight, with the hopes of funding for the memorial. Guest promised a sum of £20 on the condition that an equal sum be raised by the Development Committee. A subscription fund was initiated by the council, and the £20 needed was quickly raised. In total, the memorial would cost £75, a considerable sum for the time. The memorial would take the form of a stone column with a water fountain, surmounted by a bronze replica of Friendship. The monument would be made and erected by S.L. Gravel stonemasons of Burry Port. The inscription on the monument was carried out by a Mr. A. Giles of Burry Port, who was an uncle of another famous aviatrix, Amy Johnson, who had just returned triumphantly to the UK from her solo flight to Australia. The date of the 8th of August 1930 was set for the unveiling of the memorial. The date was chosen so to coincide with the National Eisteddfod of Wales, which was taking place in nearby Llanelli. It would be expected that many Welsh Americans visiting the Eisteddfod would make their way to Burry Port for the unveiling. Sir Arthur Whitten Brown, the first man to cross the Atlantic by plane, accepted an invitation from the council to unveil the monument. A procession led by the town band marched through the streets of Burry Port towards the monument. Along with the Welsh dragons and Union flags, many Welsh Americans in the crowd made their presence felt by waving the stars and stripes. But along with the atmosphere of celebration, there was a sense of poignancy. On July the 1st, 1929, Wilma Stultz took up 2 passengers who wanted to experience aerobatics. After several perfectly executed maneuvers, Stultz performed a loop, but at the bottom of the loop the plane went into a tailspin from which it never recovered. It was discovered that one of the passengers had jammed his feet under the rudder bars to brace himself. With no rudder control, Stultz would have found it impossible to recover, and at 400 feet he had no chance.
His death is a personal loss to me, and in aviation I don't think his place can be filled. Wilmer Stultz was one of the top 10 flyers in the world. I don't know how it could have happened to Bill Stultz. He was a marvelous pilot, and so careful. To him, piloting was not just a sport. He went about it in a thoroughly business-like way, taking every precaution that could be taken. I am quite sure this is the first crash he ever had.
Wilma Stultz, the pilot of Friendship, was dead at the age of 29.
We have welcomed home after many months our own Amy Johnson, a plucky girl who set off on a lone flight to Australia and succeeded so completely, and it is but fitting that we should gather here to honour Miss Earhart, another plucky girl from the other side who was first to fly across the Atlantic. The aeroplane which carried Miss Earhart and her 2 companions was aptly named Friendship, and it did a great deal towards cementing the friendship which we hope will ever continue between the 2 great English-speaking people. This monument will, in years to come, remind generations that Miss Earhart once made Burry Port the centre of attraction of the whole world.